Every year, they return on the same day. That's the curse of this place. On this night, it's as if the curtain between worlds is opening. As time passed, the area emptied out, people moved away, leaving the past behind. Those who remained gathered in one village and began to live together. New residents appeared from time to time, but not everyone stayed. The dead come, but their homes are already empty. It is then that evil manifests itself, destroying everything in its path. Rumors about the Dead Keys village spread, but only those who have been there or lived there know the truth. Mary and Jane stood in the shade of a sprawling tree, the heat melting the asphalt, the smell of burnt bitumen in the air. Jane sat on a tree stump, fanning herself with her Panama hat while Mary looked out for people to meet. They had arrived at the train station in the town an hour ago. They were to be met, driven, and settled. Suddenly, a cart appeared on the horizon with a man in a shabby jacket and cap. The horse trotted quickly towards them. The man asked a grandmother selling corn and pointed to the girls under a tree. "Hi, are you Francis?" Mary asked. "Yes, I am. Here, I've come for you." "We've been waiting a long time," said Mary. "There was no time. Sorry for the delay." "Hurry up, please. We're tired of standing in the heat," Mary requested sternly. The man silently loaded their belongings into the cart. Mary and Jane sat down, and they rode in silence. The girls had come on what was called a placement. They were working off student loans. That's when the state gave a loan with no interest, and if you finished your studies, you could work for 3 years in a place where they said you could not pay the money back. A lot of people took advantage of this program. The girls worked in the city for 2.5 years, and now they were sent to a village 100 kilometers away for 6 months. By the way, they were both paramedics. While they were shaking on the cart for more than an hour, the sun began to sink. The day had passed, and they still had to go and spend the night. They entered the village in the dark. The only lantern seemed a ghostly island of light in the darkness. Francis rode through the streets in silence. The sun was setting when they entered the village. The cart stopped at the gate of a house, surrounded by trees and lilacs. The man pointed to the house and disappeared. The landlady met them without greeting, led them into the house, showed them their room and facilities, and offered them dinner. Then she sternly locked the door and drew a cross over the box. "Not a step out of the house tonight," she said. "What is the matter?" Jane asked. "You'll find out for yourself," replied the landlady. The girls talked in whispers as they listened to the howling of the dog. Mary opened the curtain and looked out into the yard. Mary noticed someone in the shade of the trees. The stranger just stood there and watched. This startled Mary, and she recoiled from the window. Jane fell asleep quickly and peacefully, while Mary was plagued by nightmares. In the morning, they were awakened by the landlady, who took them to an old hospital at the edge of the village. The building was in bad shape, and they had to clean and repair the place. The girls spent several days preparing to receive patients. The first few weeks were stressful, with many residents waiting in line for appointments. It seemed to Mary that people came more to look at them than for treatment. Over time, things improved, and the appointments became more relaxed. Over the weekend, Jane and Mary were walking around the neighborhood and came across the local cemeteries. It turned out there were 2, one behind the village on a hill and the other in the woods. While eating dinner one evening, they asked the hostess about the forest cemetery, and she began to tell them a terrible story about the local cemetery. Fenny, the landlady's name, warned them not to go out after sundown because of the returning dead. But the girls were more amused by the story than frightened. It was understandable because for the young girls from the city, the legends here were more like fairy tales of madmen. But their view of the village soon changed dramatically. The next morning brought a tragedy. The neighbor's son had died in an accident. Mary was deeply unsettled, especially after seeing the lifeless boy. The funeral was scheduled at the woodland cemetery, which puzzled Mary given Fenny's warning about the returning dead. "All right, let's head back home. I'm already feeling uneasy," Jane said. After finishing their dinner, the girls discussed the boy's death. Fenny joined them. "He'll come back, that Max," the landlady suddenly said. "They'll bury him in the woods." "That's strange. Why is that?" Jane pondered. "We mentioned how the dead return from the forest cemetery once a year. There must be something there that brings them back, some force. I'm starting to understand what you were talking about." "What were you talking about?" Mary asked with interest. "The dead are devoid of emotion. They carry a dead energy, essentially evil. They can harm, right?" Jane turned to Fenny. The landlady nodded. I won't believe it until I see it myself, Mary stated firmly, then excused herself to her bedroom. Jane and Fenny conversed for a while, and by the time they parted ways, night had already fallen. The following day was Max's funeral, attended by nearly the entire village, the boy's mother with a composed demeanor and dry eyes, followed behind the coffin. Max was laid to rest in the woods near a prominent stone monument. Mary noticed another peculiarity, the absence of Christian symbols at the cemetery. There were no crosses. Instead, plain stones with the date of birth engraved on them were used. Where's the date of death? Mary asked the woman next to her. The woman stared silently at Mary, appearing bewildered. The funeral and wake left a somber impression on the girls, prompting them to return home at the earliest opportunity. Several weeks passed, and Max's death gradually receded into the past. However, the Day of the Dead, as the locals referred to it, was approaching. On the morning before that day, nervous tension permeated the village. Some were fearful, some were calm, and others had left the village for a few days. The day unfolded with tension and difficulty. After lunch, Mary was summoned to visit an elderly lady at the far end of the village, while Jane remained at the paramedic station. Suddenly, a thunderstorm erupted outside, with gusts of wind bending the trees, followed by a power outage due to a severed power line. The downpour, once a torrent, gradually abated. Without an umbrella or jacket, Jane hesitated to venture outside and opted to spend the night at the hospital. Peering out the window at the stormy landscape, Jane fretted over her friend. In another lightning flash, she noticed figures on the road, then more. About 30 individuals, adults and children, were slowly approaching the village from the direction of the forest cemetery. In the next flash, Jane recognized 4-year-old Max, recently buried. It was Maxine. They were all deceased. Such thoughts nearly caused Jane to lose consciousness. As someone gently knocked on the door, Jane startled and withdrew deeper into the room. The deceased individuals continued to linger outside the paramedic station. Meanwhile, Mary concluded her visit to the elderly lady and stepped outside. Despite borrowing an old, musty raincoat, she was nearly pushed out of the doorway by the elements. As the rain persisted and lightning illuminated the sky, Mary rushed home to change, realizing that Jane was still at the aid and treatment station. As time passed and the weather worsened, the Day of the Dead had arrived. It might have seemed ludicrous, but Mary was determined not to leave her friend alone. Glancing back at Fenny, Mary realized the old woman was utterly terrified. Lock the door behind me, and don't open it for anyone until morning, Mary instructed firmly. It's all about the numbers. They won't go away, Fenny murmured to herself. Mary looked sympathetically at the landlady and proceeded to the other end of the village to retrieve her friend. As she walked, cursing Jane, herself, the villagers, and everyone else, Mary suddenly spotted 2 individuals at a house gate, knocking rhythmically on the door. With a quick glance, Mary was nearly horrified to discover the man missing his lower jaw and the woman bearing a gaping neck wound. They were the deceased. Fear gripped Mary, and a primal instinct drove her to flee as far as possible from the scene. The dead paid no heed to her, and feeling somewhat relieved, Mary hastened back towards the infirmary. When Mary saw the dead gathering around the paramedic station, her breath caught in her throat. They were drawing closer, their intent clear. Soon they would breach the doors, and Jane might unwittingly let them in. Suddenly, someone grabbed Mary from behind and pulled her into the bushes. She fought back silently, even biting her attacker. "It hurts!" a voice hissed near her ear. "Don't move, and you'll survive." Mary twisted around and, to her surprise, recognized Francis, the man who had met them earlier. "You city folk don't believe in rural legends, do you?" Francis asked. "I do. We have to save Jane," Mary replied urgently. "It's too late. They'll be inside soon," Francis said matter-of-factly. "But you're onto something. It's about the dates, the numbers. What does it mean? The date of what?" Mary wondered aloud. "Are you daft? What dates? We need to get out of here," Francis almost shouted. "I think I understand. There's no date of death on the gravestones. None of them. That's what keeps them returning. As long as there's no date of death, they'll keep coming back, growing more furious with each passing year because they can't find peace. We need to break this cycle," Mary explained quickly. Thunder rumbled overhead, threatening to tear the sky apart. Francis led the way with Mary close behind. Suddenly, the beam of Mary's flashlight caught the figure of a child in the darkness, a boy. The child stopped right in front of Mary. His vacant stare sent shivers down her spine, a lifeless gaze. She recognized the boy, despite the horrific burns that covered his body. It was Max. Mary moved to step around him when the boy suddenly lunged towards her. She bolted after Francis. Within 10 minutes, they reached the cemetery. Along the way, Francis ducked into a shed on the outskirts and retrieved a sack containing ordinary oil paint. "What date should I write? They all died at different times," Francis shouted over the thunder. "Write today's date," Mary shouted back. Together, Mary and Francis inscribed the date of death on each grave. Gradually, the downpour eased, and stars emerged in the sky. As they approached the village, the eastern horizon began to lighten. They had survived the Day of the Dead. Upon their return to the village, they discovered that not everyone had been as fortunate. Jane and Aunt Fanny had not opened their doors to the dead. However, others had welcomed back their deceased relatives. The moment Mary began to inscribe the dates of death, the dead would fall motionless. By morning, the streets and yards were littered with the deceased, including Max. The villagers soon realized who had written the death dates, thus breaking the cycle. Some were relieved, acknowledging the unnaturalness of the event. The dead belonged in the ground, the living deserved to live. Jane chose to remain in the village, continuing her work at the old paramedic station. Though she married and then divorced, her focus remained on caring for the sick. She tended a vegetable garden, orchard, and chickens, living in Fanny's house. Mary moved to the town where she married and found happiness. The friends reunited annually when Jane visited Mary. Mary herself never returned to the village. They met specifically on the Day of the Dead. Jane distanced herself from home to avoid witnessing the horror. She never fully accepted what occurred in Dead Keys. The friends never spoke of the events they endured.